Here we go. Hello, everyone. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes before we get started. A couple of other people are looking like joining, but welcome, Lever, Michael, Graham, good to see you. Great to have your cameras on. Bruce, I'm going to ask you questions. So if love to turn your cameras on if you're not naked or if you're not eating, turn your cameras on, be part of the discussion. Hey, Peter. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our BDC Partners Workshop today. My name is Bruce McFarlane. I'm the CEO of Blue Rock. And for those of you who haven't come across Blue Rock before, we're an entrepreneurial advisory firm. So what does that mean? So we're a professional services firm with accounting, wealth management, finance, digital and law. And we've also got an investment part of our business where we co-invest in retail and hospitality and technology businesses as well. I'm also one of the fortunate co-founders of BDC Partners. So at BDC Partners, we help to remove the headaches for Australian franchisors and retailers. And that includes recruitment and franchising, development and mentoring. But today it's about property, and it's about finding the right location and to set your franchisees up for success, or even finding the right location for your company-owned stores. I know a number of you have a lot of company-owned stores in your brands. Today's going to be an interactive discussion. We're going to talk about the selection of sites, the data and the review of data, also commercial negotiations with landlords, which is really interesting in these current times, as well as managing the legal risks and ensuring that the costs are reasonable, but the quality is exceptional. So we'll hear about that as well. But before I introduce the panel, just a couple of logistical things. So yeah, it'd be great if you're involved today. Turn your cameras on and so we can have a discussion. Feel free to ask questions, in any way through the session. You can either put them in the chat if you'd like to, or you can just wave your hand and I'll go to you for a question. So all the way through, we'd love to hear from you. We will be recording the session, as Nikita said, and we'll send out a recording later. And you'll also have the details of our panelists as well. So if you've got any further questions that we don't get to today. But turning to our panel, so we've got James Turnbull. James is the General Manager of GapMap, so welcome, James.
Thank you.
Hi, James. We've got Keith Doyle, so Keith's the CEO of BDC Property Partners. Welcome, Keith.
Thanks, guys.
Got Lauren Smythe, so Lauren's an Associate Director in the Blue Rock Law Team. Welcome, Lauren.
Thanks, Bruce.
And we've got Mark Gales from Associated Projects. Mark's the General Manager, so welcome, Mark.
Hi, all.
So thanks, guys, for joining. So we're going to just kick off on the demographics and the data side of things. So James, when a business is looking to expand either interstate or internationally, nationally, what are some of the benefits of doing some demographic analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, and hi, everyone. Well, I think if you're sort of posing this question, you're probably at just the point when you've got a pretty decent sized local network. So if you're thinking interstate or national, you've probably got a good sized network, and you can, with that sort of network, you can start to do a bit of quantitative analysis on the stores and the performance. So you can actually start to narrow down specific drivers of store performance, and that could be key demographic factors like income, a particular age skew in an area, or an ethnicity. Now that analysis can kind of justify your gut feel, and then kind of allow you to sort of target those locations in a precise manner in other cities and states in a systematic way. And it can also enable you to prioritise areas once you've done that, because you can sort of do weighted average rankings of the criteria. All cities are a little bit different. So, in Sydney, around 20% of people are Asian born, but in Brisbane, it's less than 10%. So understanding where those pockets of ethnicity are across Sydney and Melbourne might be a bit easier than, say, Brisbane. So doing it with a bit of a systematic intelligence, location intelligence technique can help you with those sort of problems. One of the interesting things that might also do is surprise you. So we've worked with a bunch of operators across a variety of sectors. We did some analysis for a gym operator, and most of the customers at gyms, we probably all know, are aged between about 20 or 35-ish. That's their core customer group.
Come on, mate, 50.
Not to say that people who are 35 plus like me don't go to the gym occasionally, but there is a core group. But what we did in an analysis with this particular operator is we actually found out that it doesn't actually matter what the age profile is in a particular area. There's no strong correlation with performance. The key thing to unpack there was population density. So getting a solid catchment in size was the most important thing. So that's quite an interesting sort of finding you can unpack through the kind of quantitative analysis.
So you find that people do, like if they're in one state, they tend to go for the whole country and sort of map it out and get some really good data before they start? Or do you think, is it more that people sort of tend to just along the way go and find out, a particular area and dive into that area?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can be a bit organic. Like you might be strong in Brisbane, and then you've got some connections in Sydney, so that might just be your natural next location. You might be avoiding Melbourne because you just don't know what the next lockdown is. So they can be a bit organic in that way. If you're doing it a bit more systematically, what you might do is actually unpack the markets at a macro level and initially. So look at your category in particular or sector and see how saturated it is. So, are you going over to Perth in a pretty untapped market for your sector? And you can do that using analytics, because we can see all the competitors in your sector. And you can see, are they over-provided or under-provided for? And maybe you can start to rank the broad metro cities first. Some concepts will work well in the regions where others are capital city focused. Yep. So you can start out doing it, at a macro level, and then unpack the micro areas within it.
Cool. And so for existing brands, how do franchisors tend to use the data that you come up with to assist their franchisees?
Yeah, so it's all about sort of information sharing, I suppose, and just helping those franchisees or prospective franchisees get confidence in decision making. Just as an example, it could be that a franchisor has a subscription to a location intelligence platform, and then they can show that the prospective franchisee some outputs and show them where the clear gaps in the network are, where the key competitors are, how many, and start to talk through the site opportunities with that franchisee or potential franchisee, and go down to the level of, are we looking for particular age skews or income levels in a particular area? Maybe for existing franchisees, it can go to the next level of unpacking kind of performance in a bit more detail. So, you might have a franchisee who's got multiple stores and they're just wondering why one particular one just doesn't seem to be humming. And you work out whether it's an external factor like a catchment thing, like income or population size or ethnicity or competition, or is it actually more of a store level thing? Like, is there a customer service issue here or a store level thing that could be resolved?
Okay. And what about when there's existing sites that you've got and they've got the data, they've got access to the data? Do you get involved in helping them, really drive performance within an existing site, or some of the data that you can use to manage performance where it's not going so well?
Yeah, look, I think on that front, it's probably, to my point before, kind of just breaking down whether it is a site-specific issue that can be resolved. I think that's where where our role would kind of stop, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And then it comes down more to the operator or another professional to sort of work through that store level issue if it is identified as such.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce, we would sometimes carry out what we call a traffic light report in that instance. So depending on the size of the portfolio and how it was performing, we'd have a really good look under the bonnet and find out if it is a people issue, if it is a location issue, or is it just occupancy costs, So sometimes, you look at all three, but there are a traffic light report, that we'd carry out, particularly for maybe a larger portfolio that has a real mix of underperforming stores. However, the benchmarks, would lead you to believe that there shouldn't be such a change in maybe sales, but you do find it, and it's actually quite common, So you need to really understand the why of what that is, and as I said, it generally comes under three headings. It'll be people, and it's always a bigger percentage of people, strangely, and then it'll be location, or it'll be just it's a rental issue.
Yeah. And James, what about brands that sort of looking at what's the maximum number of sites that they're that they can have for their brand, and how many territories or how many sites? What sort of things do you think about when you're just looking at the whole of the country?
Yeah, so if you sort of start to pose the question about maximum store network, you probably, again, you've either got huge grand ambitions as a fledgling business, or you're somewhat established and have got some customer data already. So you can sort of know how your stores are performing and potentially where they're drawing their customers from. And if you've got customer data, you can ingest that into spatial analytics and work out how big your catchments are. In lieu of that, there's other techniques. You can use device data to understand catchments, or just broad, spatial, 3K type radiuses, and then start to map out, how many territories could we fit in a geography based on, maybe the competitors in there and how their networks are rolled out. If there's an established competitor, that might be a bit of a proxy. And that can sort of set the maximum. And then what you'll do within that is prioritize based on your key criteria. So if you kind of know that high income areas is where you think your best stores perform, and a particular age demographic, then you can prioritize those territories in order of where those criteria are best, I suppose. And with these kind of location intelligence platforms, you can do this territory stuff as a piece of work that then gets put into the platform and visualized, and it's kind of a live, living, breathing document, for want of a better term, that can be visual to both the franchisor and shown to franchisees as well.
Michael, you've obviously a pretty established network at Boost. What's the key data points that you look at when you're looking for new sites?
Some of those are what James mentioned. Having said that, it's well and good to identify a particular suburb, precinct, even shopping centre. It comes down to a lot. There can be a huge difference between one end of the shopping centre and another, and that's something that it can't be necessarily mapped, and that makes a huge difference. Like I can think of some shopping centres, even near where I lived. It took like our 5th offer from the landlord before we actually accepted the site, because the previous ones were far inferior, and that can make an uplift of I reckon 30% in sales in some instances. So we do a little bit of what James said, and look at footfall and percentage of hit rate, etc. And then there's a gut feel. There's a big element of gut feel, and where we know we want to be. That's not to say we don't always get it right, but for the most part we do.
What about Ferguson Player, Pete? What sort of use of data are you using?
We use geotech data, bit of competition for gap maps, but that's all good. Like Michael said,
we're all complimentary, Pete. They're all complimentary.
The gut feel, of course, experience, but also a variety of input from different departments as well too. So we get our support guys out there. The marketing guys will go out and have a look as well too. So all that input goes into the recipe to hopefully make a good decision.
Mm-hmm. And welcome, David. When you're looking to recruit franchisees, what about the use? How important is it to have the great data behind it?
It makes it a hell of a lot easier because they see that the franchisor has gone to the effort of not just throwing a dart against the map to basically go on inquiries come in here, so we better entertain it. It actually backs up the whole purpose as to why you're recruiting a franchisee for that area, and it's backed up with demographic analysis and gives them confidence.
So we'll just change topic for just a little bit now. So Keith, what about doing a deal with the landlord? Of course, the joys of working from home here. So doing a deal with a landlord, when franchisors are looking to expand, what information should they have available ready to go?
I think probably depending on the size of the portfolio where it currently sits, Bruce, but I think a lot of what James touched on, we'd actually really highly recommend. So, benchmarking the existing portfolio and understanding why you've got a poor performer and why one isn't a poor performer. So the territory planning needs to be obviously looked at, and that can be done, as James mentioned, through the gap maps piece, identifying things like, your competitor, that density, population, demographics, drive time between stores. I mean, these are all things that you would look at from a franchisor's perspective to see what the ultimate portfolio could look like. And then it's probably what we tend to do is, and we've done it in the past, we'll create what we call a hunting ground report, which again just gives you that halo customer and gives you the real key drivers as to what that customer looks like, and making sure then within those territories you've got a ready-made market in front of you. So, you know, most retailers are going to look for the same things. The main drivers, you know, the everyday needs, you know, they're always going to want, whether it's a strip location or a shopping center, but like, you know, visibility will be key, convenience, parking, you know, and in a lot of cases now as well, you've got precincts being built in the centers where the adjoining tenancies are really important for certain retailers. You know, they like to be within a precinct. And, you know, like we're learning as we go. One of our clients at the moment, it's a relatively new business. I think his portfolio existing is about 25, and you know, he's learning all the time. And obviously schools, for his main skew is a female skew, and you know, he felt that like a lot of the portfolio was performing well that had close proximity to schools, because the moms were dropping the kids off and then they were going for their session. So, you know, it's come to the fore now that hospitals are a big part of that too. So I think as you're looking at everything all told, I think it's you know, benchmarking your existing portfolio if you've got one, or if not, like we've got a caller on today, Ishan, that's starting off his retail career looking to open his first mobile phone accessory store. You know, understanding what his customer looks like really enables us to make sure that we're picking the right location for him, and also getting the right rent thresholds in terms of benchmarks as to what that needs to look like for a startup versus maybe something that's already, you know, got a good trading history. And, you know, you can tend to sometimes use that gut a little bit more and take a little bit more risk.
So so how do you assess the risks compared to the benefits for the sites?
Oh, look, I mean, I think anytime you sign a lease, there's risk. You know, I think for me, the key is that you try and de-risk it as much as you can, you know, so your feasibility is really important. And I think that goes for a startup or somebody that's got 50 stores within a portfolio. I mean, you know, understanding the feasibility and probably being a little bit conservative around what your projections are, you know, and being probably a little bit more conservative around what, you know, cost of goods and wages are, for example, and understanding that your GP will never really end up where it is. So I think a really good, strong feasibility that gives you an honest appraisal as to what maybe the return on investment needs to look like, or what the EBITDA needs to look like. And then basically, you know, if that particular property, you know, sits in with that, well then great, it's a possibility to continue to maybe look at that location. But if it doesn't, it's always, you know, a question, do we walk away? And I think this is where retailers always sometimes, it's difficult, because, you know, a good location can be a great location, but if it's at if the commerce is not right, well, the deal is not right, and you need to, you know, just move away.
Yeah, it's that's right. What about since COVID? There's been it's been really interesting trying to look at different states and what's the current trends in the different states. Obviously, WA and South Australia and predominantly Queensland have been COVID free for most of the period, whereas obviously New South Wales and Victoria have had a challenging 18 months. So how are you seeing the trends in shopping centres compared to strip shops, and what people are looking for with deals at the moment?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. We've kind of had a two-speed economy, haven't we? Because literally, I think WA, I'd say it's fair to say, hasn't been affected whatsoever. Queensland only marginally. So I think the expectations around Sydney and Melbourne are slightly different. I think it's common knowledge now that the trend is probably a worldwide trend as where it's going, and it's certainly seen more of a localized shopping environment during lockdowns, where people are creating habits and shopping locally. They probably don't feel as much exposure to a large asset in terms of keeping their health, you know, under control. So I think that certainly has played out. And I think when we look at people like Target, for example, that have somewhat backtracked a little bit on their initial strategy in terms of some certain assets that they were looking to close, have now subsequently seen 15 to 20% increase in sales, and actually have decided to, you know, it's a U-turn, and they're holding and then building a DC compatible with that store from a distribution point of view. So that's been a real trend, and we're seeing this same trend even with some of the telcos, you know, in regards to maybe, you know, bigger CBD locations and very small regional locations. And some of those strategies are nearly turning 360. So it's certainly been a trend, and I think it's fair to say that it's been a bit of a worldwide trend, and it will probably it will certainly, I think, continue. And I think the assets that have got convenience shopping and everyday needs catered for, I think you'll probably find that the mix in those particular centres will probably improve, because as people shop in an environment, they do, there's expectations that they've got an offer. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out further, because again, the other part of this question is probably, well, we haven't really seen how things are going to play out in terms of who remains in the market and maybe who unfortunately falls away. And I think probably that will be the new year before we really see that. And that'll obviously affect vacancy rates and so on and so forth. But I still don't see that changing. I think the CBD will be a very, very big challenge in the short term, irrespective of how big a retailer you are, because purely you're not going to get the foot traffic. And I think that's going to be a really interesting play for maybe some of the larger retailers that are in a position to maybe structure deals that give them some peace of mind in the short term. And I'm talking short term, maybe 2 to 3 years. But with the long-term view that hopefully this will return to some degree of normality, and we'll be experiencing foot traffic as we would have prior to COVID.
That's right. We've got a few different brands that are, different styles of businesses on the call. So Luke, Pack and Send, you've been I imagine there's a lot of city related sites that you've got. What are you finding in the market at the moment?
We're finding with our offering as a business itself, the actual locations, whether they be in the city, the suburban or the regional, it's not actually, COVID hasn't really affected them in the way that they're trading at the moment. We've seen, just as a general overview with our business model, more of a shift of moving towards more commercial industrial units, where we're getting more of a hybrid retail and a logistic type service centre. And we're finding that is a very strong market for us to sort of tap into really competitively. Like, there's not much shift from the landlord's perspective, because it's an in demand, where it used to be something that was purely blue collar or the boys' toys, a man cave sort of thing. But now we're getting more businesses that are typically, we're in a retail space, that are seeing the ability for them to tap into that area. But we haven't seen much of decline in the retail space itself, or detrimental aspects to the business within our retail areas, in particular CBDs across the network, that they've been performing well. Okay.
And what about, so Graham or Jason, you've got some big plans at Clark Rubber for expansion. What sort of areas are you looking at, and what are you seeing? What trends are you seeing? Jason, you've been nominated to answer that question.
Thanks, Graham. Look, obviously the businesses that are in the lockdown areas are doing it tough. Outside of that, our WA and Queensland stores particularly are doing well, and very, very much so regional. So that localised shopping is showing still growth on last year, and last year we had a phenomenal year. So we're not seeing that reflected across the country, but we are seeing that reflected in some locations. Pleasing for us, the interest is still really strong in the open markets. So we're still pretty hopeful of a few greenfields before the end of the year, which is great. What we're still not seeing, and I agree with one of the earlier people around, we probably won't see it till the new year, is around some of the vacancy rates changing. So we're still seeing it being pretty competitive and pretty tightly held in the 5 to sort of 800 square metre boxes that we're looking at. Still pretty competitive from a rental point of view. And while it's tough, we're pretty buoyant that once we get out of this, we'll come back. And retail across the board will come back really strong.
Yeah. And Leah, what about API, your brands? How's the moving sites? Is that something, is there big growth plans and looking at areas, or is it just more around looking after the current network?
Yeah, so I can certainly speak from a Queensland point of view, as opposed to a national view, and really it reiterates a lot of what has already said before me. It's definitely what we've seen here in Queensland over the last sort of 18 months is definitely that 2 speed. So, you've seen the hardest hit areas being CBD. versus the convenience sites. And what we're seeing here is a lot of more greenfield development still coming through, where they've got the major +6 specialty. That seems to be the bigger trend, whereas the larger centres, any development they had has really pulled back just in these uncertain times, and that smaller convenience is moving ahead. So very much what everyone has said before me.
Well, and now, Keith, the thing that everyone wants to know is where we're going to get the best deals. So what are the incentives that are being offered? You know, surely you can pick up some bargains in the CBD in Melbourne at the moment. What's happening?
Yeah, look, I mean, I suppose in terms of incentives, you know, like to say there's a general rule is probably foolish, because, you know, it varies, Bruce, depending on the asset, depending on the landlord, and depending on the vacancy rate. I think it is fair to say, however, that CBDs are going to probably bend over a little bit harder to try and incentivize retailers to, as I said maybe earlier, take a little bit of a risk in the short term. So certainly conversations around maybe, you know, a percentage rent are certainly conversations being had for a number of years, and then potentially the remainder of the lease might be an average of the 2 or 3. So there's certainly conversations we're having. And when I look at some of the renewals that we're doing around the CBD, that's kind of how we're playing it. So I think it's a very difficult one to call, but you know, by and large, CBD landlords will have to incentivize a retailer, irrespective of what category they sit in, because you're going to want some peace of mind. I think generally speaking, you know, when we look at strip locations, which we're heavily involved in at the moment with a number of like clients in that health and wellness space, depending on the landlord, if it's not necessarily your typical institutional landlord and it's a smaller landlord, the incentives are probably more by way of a rent-free period, and there's not as much cash incentive. And we're finding that certainly a trend, let's say. But even with some of the larger institutional landlords, I know that you know, they've also had a tough time, let's say, and certainly some of those incentives that you would normally maybe come to expect are not quite there. Again, it does depend very much on the asset and what that vacancy rate looks like, and also what the mix looks like too, Bruce, in terms of what, you know, what gaps they're trying to fill within their asset. You know, there has been a lot of lazy leasing going on over a number of years, and I think if COVID does another thing for us, it'll make the landlords be a little bit more aware of what the mix needs to look like. So, you know, getting the right tenant in there is really important, versus just getting another tenant that, you know, they can ride hard on the rent and give them no incentive.
So Bruce, Ben and Jerry's, you know, you guys have got some big expansion plans as well. You've been able to negotiate some great deals in this current environment.
Yeah, I think a couple. Really varies on the state and the area you're looking at, and it's all the kind of factors that Keith mentioned in terms of the landlord. We are certainly seeing a bit more flexibility around willingness to look at percentage rent, even if it's just for initial 1 year or maybe even 18 months. Incentives, I'm not seeing loads of huge incentives, as Keith said as well. And then the same markets that were tight beforehand, like so your Brisbane CBD, Queenstown over in New Zealand, or Byron, we're still struggling. I think it'll be until next year that we see them start to open up, and maybe we'll be able to get into those key markets for us. But yeah, it's a completely different based on where you're looking. You know, the tourist hit areas like a Surfers Paradise, a Bondi, where there's no international tourism, are struggling, and therefore we've been able to get a good deal site down in Bondi. But the ones where there's still fairly robust, good regional local traffic, landlords are holding firm because they're still getting some good incentives with land tax, and still fairly well populated because they're not kicking anybody out.
Michael, the Boost brand helping get some good incentives for at the moment.
Gee, it's very hard to say. It's such a mixed bag. Given the breadth of our portfolio, it's hard for me to comment. You know, like, it's interesting to hear Bruce say he's had a great deal down at Bondi. Bondi's, for us, it's actually kicked goals. Like, it's been Bondi, the one down at Bondi Beach, that store's gone from, when I say from strength to strength, it was struggling before COVID hit. One of the best things that they did was put a COVID testing station across the road. And since then, it's been absolutely booming. So it's hard for me to say. And then there was a lot of deals done last year that were for, and because we have a portfolio of brands, because we did a deal on a particular site and got better than code, we might have, done a deal on, looking at other assets of theirs and putting other brands into other assets. So it's broad. Not too much I can say without going into specifics, Bruce.
Come on, give some secrets away, mate. What's going on?
No. Look, I'd love to say that it's really, really exciting, and for the most part, we've had some good wins, it's so broad. That said, and this is public record, so it doesn't really worry me. This half, from a Boost perspective, we're putting down 18 or 19 new stores. So there's still the opportunity for growth out there, and for the most part, we get good deals. One thing that we're working on, because we've been done over in a couple of cases, were what do we call it? When development clauses. So we've got to have development clauses where we go in early into a shopping centre, which we don't typically. There's been a few that we've been into and haven't opened up fully, but we're getting some of those as well. So.
And it was nice of you to get, Betty's Burgers on the news all around the world, mate. Just had to have a little earthquake to get some publicity.
That was just absolutely huge. And Troy McDonough is the consummate media performer. I think I know where he's moving after. It'll be straight into the media after his performances last week, but they were very, very good. So, but one thing I was interested in, just Bruce, going back to something that David said earlier, which fascinates me, and it's funny because Kerry Clark's calling me and it's actually a legal issue. It is like, I'm fascinated by the diligence that some brands do. We're a very, very conservative brand. We would, even based on the diligence, we would never share that with our partners. We would never hold that out and say, well, this is what the data shows us. We always say to them, do your due diligence. We've always been to the point where, David, we say, we don't ask for a business plan. We say, have you done one? But we don't ask to see it, because then that can be taken as a representation. That's the way we've always been. So it's an interesting, compared to what you were not necessarily advocating that we should do, but what some brands may do. And yeah.
I think that's Janine's reluctance in spending money on lawyers, because she got, at the early days, there was a lot of legal expenses in different parts of the business. So take the conservative path for the entrepreneur.
Oh, and that said, the number of legal cases we have is just so ridiculously small. I mean,
yeah, I know.
You've seen how tight Kerry is.
Thanks, Michael. I might just go to speaking of lawyers, we've got one on the call who's going to talk to us about the risks of and the benefits of in the leasing side. Once, Keith's done a deal on the commercial negotiations, it's over to Lauren to negotiate the lease. But before they do that, what sort of things should the franchisors be thinking about to help set up their franchisees to succeed?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I think you can't go past the importance of getting the basics right. So just making sure that the length of the term of the lease is the same as the franchise agreement, and then also taking into consideration options. So making sure they're actually available. I think it's often assumed that a new lease will be secured on similar terms when the current one expires. But if there aren't options available, landlords don't actually have an obligation to offer a new lease. So if they have plans for the centre which don't involve the business being in the current location or even in the centre at all, this can actually jeopardise the business. Or it also shifts the balance of power, and then you can find yourself with the landlord offering new leases on pretty unfavourable terms, with significant rent increases, for example, which will eat directly into the bottom line or change the value of the business as well. And then otherwise, it's just ensuring that the lease is on favourable commercial terms for both parties. So getting the right advice on current market trends, rent reviews, percentage rents, and then not overcommitting with security deposits or bank guarantees, and having them fixed for the term or provided at a reduced amount, particularly in circumstances where the landlord is also asking for personal guarantees. And Keith's obviously touched on fit out contributions and lease incentive payments as well. So if they are provided, the payments are typically documented in a deed outside the terms of the lease, and carry conditions, including that the money must be spent on the fit out, with obligations to provide documentary evidence, such as receipts and invoices. Landlords quite often also have clawback rights to sum or all of the contribution if the lease ends or it's transferred to another party. So it's really important to get a lawyer to look at the finer details in the incentive deed. And also quite critically too, landlords often want ownership rights over the fit out, at least to the value of the contribution. So it's pretty important that if your franchisee actually wants to own the fit out, that the franchisor is not conferring ownership rights to a landlord as well.
So the clawbacks are interesting, particularly where there's a franchisee sells this transfers and sells their business within the period of the lease. It's a bit of a tricky one. But so there's a few areas of leases as from the legal point of view that you're protecting and managing risk. What sort of areas are they? And is it any different now during COVID, or are they the same things that you're seeing pre-COVID?
Well, I'm seeing a lot more pandemic type clauses just generally, probably from a tenant franchisee perspective. If the lease has a COVID clause, ideally it allows for closures without penalties, or abatement in circumstances where the government's imposed restrictions on access or density quotients, rather than just abatements where there's complete prohibitions, because you usually find with government health orders that they don't necessarily say that you can't access premises. So you don't want to be caught out where you can't actually use it, but you don't entitled to an abatement. In terms of risk generally, it comes down to whether, I guess, the franchisor or the franchisee is holding the lease. So there's two options. So it's either the franchisor entering into the lease with the landlord and then issuing a license agreement, and then allowing the franchisee to occupy occupy the premises, and then comply with the franchisor's lease during the term, or the franchisee entering into the lease directly with the landlord. Probably the most common option is the franchisor acting as tenant, that's probably more common because the franchisor generally has better bargaining power with landlords, especially if it's a large national chain, and they can negotiate more favourable lease terms, especially with major institutional landlords like Westfield and GPT. And those types of landlords are generally more open to negotiations with a multi-site tenant, as both parties tend to have more at stake. It's probably also a preferred option because the franchisor will retain control over the premises, and that's from the initial negotiation stages, where it can actually determine the terms of the lease, and also with regards to its dealings with the landlord throughout the term as well. Another plus side to that is, whilst retaining control over the premises, the license agreement between the franchisor and franchisee usually requires the franchisee to comply with the lease as if it were the tenant. And the franchisor will typically have the same rights under the license agreement as the landlords, including the ability to serve breach notices and terminate for defaults as well. There are drawbacks. So if the franchisee defaults, the franchisor will obviously continue to remain liable, and that default may be a result of unpaid rent or damage to the premises caused by the franchisee. But again, that risk can be avoided or minimised by requiring the franchisee to provide the bank guarantee rather than the franchisor providing that bank guarantee to the landlord. Another thing to consider too is leases typically don't include a specific franchise or license clause, which permits the franchisor to license the premises to a franchisee. So the landlord will usually insist on the license being subject to approval before the franchisee can occupy the premises. So it is helpful to negotiate the basic framework of the occupancy license during the negotiation stage. And to the extent that you can, it's also helpful if you can provide the landlord with a pro forma license agreement as well.
So during COVID, the structure of the leasing deals, with some with franchisors and some with franchisees, it caused some level of complications in those rent reductions and rent abatement discussions. How did you find that?
It depends what side of the fence you were sitting on. So last year for me, it was largely negotiating for tenants as franchisors for their with respect to their franchisees. Yep. And it was complicated by the fact that in many circumstances, the franchisors that holding the lease didn't classify as eligible tenants, but their franchisees did. Initially, we ran the argument that they had a back-to-back relationship. So where a franchisee was entitled to rent relief, it should naturally pass through from the landlord sort of directly through to the franchisee, and the franchisor shouldn't have to wear the pain of paying the difference in the rent. That sort of position shifted a little, but unfortunately this time around in the updated scheme, the legislation hasn't sufficiently dealt with it. But I think it's sort of the general consensus is that, for the benefit of the relationship and the parties sort of moving forward and ensuring sort of longevity of business, that you don't have one party suffering, in terms of having to carry the rent, for the benefit of the other.
Yeah. And you mentioned the new scheme. So there's a whole lot of complexity. I know that's a webinar in itself, is to go through all the different jurisdictions and what's currently, but what are you saying to your franchisor clients at the moment and how to manage it?
The compliance requirements, particularly in Victoria, are a lot more onerous than they were last time. It's not tied to JobKeeper, so there's a couple of qualifiers. The turnover threshold, like last year, but there's a minimum decline in turnover of 30%, and there's various different turnover tests that can be applied. So you've got to get in touch with your accountant, get them to run the numbers, speak to a lawyer just to confirm eligibility, and make sure that when you're lodging your applications for rent relief, that they're compliant. I think you only get 3 shots at lodging a compliant request for rent relief, and then if you don't do it correctly and in time, then you'll miss the opportunity altogether.
Cool.
I think that time, Lauren, isn't it, from memory in Victoria, is end of September. So if it's not in by end of September, they won't backdate. That's right, Keith. There's Thursday. They've got Thursday to lodge their application if they want the benefit of the retrospective rent relief from the 28th of July. Yeah.
Cool. So the last thing is about, when you're looking to expand your network, the franchisee or the franchisor, whoever's in charge of the fit out, is trying to manage a budget and make the site look as good as possible. So Mark, when they're looking to expand, how do you assist them prior to negotiating the lease?
Yeah, so I mean, what we look at in terms of that is, I guess, feasibility from a design and a build perspective. So risks around timing, risks around costs, risks around the site itself and the physical conditions, and possible opportunities as well. So I often say that if there's 2 sites, side by side, they look the same, that one could have 100K sort of pitfall in it, or the other one could have 100K opportunity in it. So they're the sorts of things that we look for. So in terms of timing, one of the big things to look out for is obviously the planning side. So are there any planning applications required? So I'm probably more talking strip shops than something inside Westfield. If there's a planning application, what type of planning application that is. So, is under the planning scheme, is it a permissible use? And then what are the other conditions around that planning application, and what's the time implications around that and cost implications? What's the last approved use? So we often see that, just because there's a gym in a certain location, it doesn't mean that you can put a gym back in there, because, historically, sometimes people don't get the correct use put on that building. So we check things like that. So they're big risks, obviously, to cost and timing. What we provide back is just all the information in the form of a report to help with those leasing negotiations. Worst case, it's a question of feasibility of the site overall, but more often than not, it's just about looking at that and seeing how it's all tied up through the lease. Costs, we look at things that impact cost, and we do that via a site feasibility audit. So we go out to site, we've got a 102-point checklist that we do to check the site. So we do it via project management software. So we go through, and a lot of it's just laborious, simple things. But what happens is over the 102 points that you sort of document and have a look through, it tells a story about that job site and how it all sort of comes together. So, we look at things like services, we look at things like the structure, we look at, things like flooring. So we look at everything to sort of say, okay, what's the potential pitfalls on this side and what needs to be considered and taken into account, and possibly, against another possible site to say, well, what does that site bring and what's the potential opportunities and or risks? So I guess for us, it's about trying to, take out some of those surprises and take out the uncertainty and put some certainty into the whole thing via those two things. So I hope that answers the question.
No, it does. And one of the major pieces of the puzzle for you guys is managing franchisors, franchisees, landlords through the whole project to ensure that it runs as smoothly as possible, given everyone's deadlines in the project. So how do you go about managing all the different parties involved?
Yeah, so I think it's about communication. I guess the first thing is about understanding. So if we've done the audit, we understand the site, we understand the process, we understand the scope, then it's all about bringing the parties together to understand who's doing what and who's responsible for what and what the timing is involved in that. So obviously a project schedule to map out what's happening when, to make sure that all fits in so that at the end it all comes together and the project's delivered on time. So, each individual party has probably a big long list of responsibilities. And all those responsibilities are quite timely. So our part we play is to try and help bring that together, organise PCG meetings, so we can catch up, talk about the project in the lead up and then through the delivery of the project as well, just to make sure everything's on track and on time. So there's always a few little surprises that come up that need to be dealt with too. So
cool. And you mentioned costs earlier. So, managing costs in the project, what sort of tips do you have for either the franchisee or the franchisors to, when they're in the design stage, to ensure that, that the costs are kept as low as possible with not, just not missing out on quality?
Yeah, I mean, you can capture costs obviously at all different stages. Leasing is probably the first one to make sure that, if there is a cost on a job site, whether that be heating and cooling is obviously a big one, and extraction that comes up, who's responsible for that and where that cost lies. So that goes back to the landlord. That's obviously, great from a lessee's perspective. Then through design, I guess, there's different materials, there's different ways to build things. So getting the right advice on the right way to tackle even that particular site, because there's many different ways to tackle that site, by moving entrances, by attacking sites in different ways, you'll get different outcomes in terms of costs. So looking at that from a design perspective, materials, there's always new materials coming out, but also just asking the question across every scope item. So the mechanical, there might have been a mechanical consultant who's done the design for the heating and cooling, but is there a different way to attack that? From a design and build perspective as well. So I think across every line item, there's the ability to just question and have a look at it all, and that can, the sum of all those little pieces can add up to quite a lot of money. So definitely opportunities in there.
And so, Keith, are you working with your clients as well around that sort of process and with Mark and the team?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of work with Mark and the team, and I suppose one of the projects at the moment. Well, the X-Golf was just built in Cairns; they've just finished it, and then we're looking at a big project here in Bayside at the moment, which is an ex-bank, an ANZ bank, that's going to be turned into a food and beverage operator. So the amount of mechanical and drainage and everything that gets involved in something like that, there's a massive cost. So yeah, look, it's a tricky one, I'll be honest. And even from a 100 square meter box, for example, when you're talking about air conditioning and so on, and the landlord's responsibilities and the condition of it and so forth, there's a lot to be, you can easily get done and miss a couple of things and to your detriment, and it's costly. So, and everything being relative to the retailer, it's something that you've got to make sure you're on top of. So the checklist Mark talks about, we actually use that in many respects when we do a site visit in the first instance. And depending on the actual retailer that we represent, some of it's not as important, but a lot of the fundamentals are always there that you need to check. And unless you push back on the landlord at the very beginning, it's always difficult to kind of retrospectively kind of work backwards. So very important.
Graham, I know you've been very focused on ensuring that the Clark Rubber, the cost of opening a new site is as low as possible, so you can, attract some more franchisees. Sort of how have you gone about that in your business?
Look, in essence, when we bought the business a year ago, they were basically attracting, with no disrespect, an idiot with money. So if you had the freight and you could actually pay for it, we'd take the money and bring it on board as a franchisee. And anyone that's got a franchise organization knows that that's a road to nowhere. And we sort of came across a number of people that were really good operators, some of them being maybe store managers that just didn't have that 500,000-600,000, maybe up to 750,000. So we sort of broke it down for them to go, in essence, you need sort of a certain amount for a bank guarantee, which we can help you with. You need a little bit for stock, which we can help fund you with, and broke it down to the component parts and brought it down to about as well as also sort of reducing our upfront and spreading our upfront, amortizing over that period of time, so that there wasn't this massive hurdle of people who would sort of poop themselves when they looked at it and went, oh my God, I've got to spend 700K. Whereas if they look at it and go, well, hold on a second, I need to spend 150 to 250,000 in stock, depending on seasonality, and then it's plus this, and we can finance the fixtures and we can finance the bank guarantee. It sort of just brings it down to the point where we can now attract a lot more people into the network because it's not as such a big hurdle, and work with them because you've now become an accredited or authorized. I forget what term the banks use, whatever they call it. Basically, they'll lend to the franchise network. And it makes it less scary for the franchisee at the end of the day. It allows us to be a lot more selective to bring on board people that we believe will best represent the brand and a best chance of success than just a schmuck with a checkbook.
And Dave, I know as your tradie background in the salts of the earth, that was something that you really focused on, is ensuring that the build costs were reasonable. How did you go about that?
I went out and got my builder's license. and took it in house and took full control of it, because when it gets to that, like having done a couple of jobs with Mark and the team at Associated, that auditing report, we've just seen alone the amount of money that's been saved. Like, sites where air conditioning units are not up to scratch for that site, and nobody would know. And as soon as you sign a lease and you sign that disclosure document, well, it's your tough titties on that, unfortunately. And that saved the tenant a fortune, so like it is so important that you are monitoring that on the way in, because it's all about ROI for the franchisee.
Yeah, that's right. And Luke, do you get involved in assisting the franchisees save some money and get the best outcome on the fit outs?
Yeah, that's something that we've been more actively involved in the last couple of years. In the past, it was a bit of a hands-off approach where we just let it to our shop fitter and the franchisee. But now it's a lot more involved, and especially early on, we don't have a checklist, or that's what Mark mentioned, but our initial visit, we go through, and it's through trial and error that we've learned, but we go through all the possible scenarios, from, you mentioned air conditioning, from the plumbing, ventilation, from the legal perspective, the demo clauses, options. We go through all that so we can lay it all out for the franchisee, and then also our shop fitters are better prepared too when they're coming in and having a look at what the scope of works are. I think it's really key for us to be able to have that franchisee, for us to be involved with it as well, because they feel like they're contributing to it, because they are investing their own money into it. So if they feel that they're involved in some capacity, that they seem to be more willing and open to the process of how we do things, as opposed to just saying, yeah, open up your checkbook, this is how much you need, leave it to us.
Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left. If anyone's got any final questions or comments, Keith, any other on the right location, any other tips for people?
Oh, look, I just think by and large, you know, the analytics piece and the data now for us is just paramount, Bruce. You know, it's understanding the why. You know, what I ask the team is here every time, you know, they put forward a property, it's why for that client. And, you know, it's got to tick so many boxes. So, you know, we do a lot of work on that. The gap maps, each and every one of our clients has got a platform on there, a gap maps platform, and we filter that up with every single competitor and all the drivers that need to be there. And when we look at a location, there's just so much stuff that we look at first, you know, and then run all the reports, you know, as to maybe why we think it's the right location and for what reason. So I just think, you know, yeah, moving forward, understanding that the trend is potentially changing, so, you know, understanding what the MAT is in a particular asset and what maybe the specialty rates per square meter are and what they once were are moving. And I think understanding that, as maybe Michael said earlier on, when you've got a large, really large portfolio, you'll see plenty of indifference there, but there's still so many common denominators that you need to get right in terms of making your decision as to where the next location is.
James, any tips on the data side from?
Keith's taken the words out of my mouth. He's done it too much justice, so I won't add too much more.
No worries. And Mark?
No, look, I think it's just about understanding those sites and what the opportunities are. So one thing I didn't say, like I had a few examples of just different sites we've ordered in the last couple of weeks. One we did yesterday. We knew roughly what the layout was going to be, where doing the design work as well. But when we went to site, we had a look at, say, the entrance location. We had nominated in a certain spot. We found out that there was a bit of a height difference between the footpath and the internal slab. So that meant putting in a DDA ramp, you know, which would have been a 3 metre long ramp. So you're talking quite a bit of money there. So we're actually advising to move the entry back to a different spot and compromising a little bit on design. We found a disabled toilet that wasn't on the plan. And so where we're going to demo that toilet block, we thought, let's keep that toilet block and then let's rehash the plan a little bit. So that was another thing that we came up with the audit. And then that particular site had a change of use. So that's something we can't get around, but it's a fairly straightforward change of use. We found one acoustic consideration with the neighbour next door that we just need to take into consideration and deal with, you know, hopefully through the lease side as well. So yeah, just all these little things that come together. So I think for me, it's a devil's in the detail, I guess.
Not to mention that one site, Mark, that we went to take a look at where they're advertising at 852 square meters, and we measured it up and it was 830.
That would make a bit of a difference. It's right on 2 o'clock. I know there's a couple of people said they have to jump off right on time for the next meeting. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, Mark, James, Lauren, and Keith. So thanks a lot for your insights today. And thanks again for everyone for joining. Stay safe, stay strong, and hopefully we're out of this lockdown soon.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.